Our next keynote speaker, Professor Gordon Masterton, who is Professor now at the University of Edinburgh and Deputy Convenor of UKCRIC, the UK Collaboratorium for Research and Infrastructure and Cities, of which DAFNI, as we've heard, forms one of the three pillars. Gordon, before moving to Edinburgh, had a very distinguished career and continues to have in infrastructure, especially in major projects. So it's wonderful to have you with us here this morning, Gordon, to provide some deeper infrastructure perspectives around the challenges facing DAFNI, the challenges which we're trying to address within UKCRIC and how we can take those forwards in the future. Over to you, Gordon.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Jim. And good morning, everyone, and very well done to the DAFNI team for its successes and for organising this event as well. Until we can meet again, this is the next best alternative, sharing experiences and having dialogue of sorts. And it is part of the human condition that we have a compulsion to communicate, and these online methods, in their way, triumphs of digital and data-driven innovation, have rescued us for the last year from bleak isolation. I'm, as you heard from Jim, a very late arrival to the academic world. I'd retired as Vice President of a large infrastructure and programme management consultancy when the University of Edinburgh coaxed me back to work to take a new chair of future infrastructure. So I've got an industrial and a bit of an academic perspective, but very much biased towards the former. And the topic allocated to me this morning was meeting the UK's infrastructure investment agenda. There's an obvious self-selecting source for that topic's already been mentioned. Next slide, Marion. The November 2020 National Infrastructure Strategy, still current. It reflects the situation mid-pandemic, say, so it retains relevance of the times, and it has been endorsed by Treasury with a foreword from the Prime Minister. So it's a statement of intent that reveals the current strategic thinking at the highest level in the UK. And it has the benefit of having been informed by the National Infrastructure Commission, which is apolitical as far as that is ever possible. And these quotes from the strategy reveal the intention of the government, which clearly sees infrastructure as a principal agent of economic recovery, with, one hopes, the subtitle of fairer, faster, greener, providing the necessary lenses that determine which infrastructure projects and programmes should form the infrastructure revolution that the government wants to deliver. Personally pleased to see that central quote on infrastructure's profound impact on people's lives. It should be unnecessary to say that, since the motivation for building anything should always have been to improve the quality of life for people. But in an advanced civilization that one hopes we live in, those infrastructure improvements tend to be generally taken for granted. We flick a switch, or we ask Alexa and lights come on. We turn a tap, healthy drinking water flows freely. We heat our homes with pre-programmed central heating. We decide we need to travel to another city or another country, and we have the luxury of options to choose the most convenient transport, pandemics accepted. 200 years ago, all of those would have been pipe dreams of science fiction. But today, the wonder of infrastructure improvements has been diminished by familiarity. Next slide. Until that is, it's not there. Our relationship with infrastructure only becomes focused in this country when we lose it. And then infrastructure in that way, it's a bit like our well-loved aged relatives. We grieve when they're gone, and we suffer pangs of regret that we'd not done more to appreciate them when they were with us. But there's no retirement plan for infrastructure. It's just expected to keep on going till it drops. And intense weather events that cause the flooding, the coastal erosion, or landslips are examples of infrastructure failing to be resilient enough to survive these perturbations. And of course, we'll have far more of those as climate change throws new challenges at us. Next slide, Marion. Our bridges, once built, are felt to be ever present when they show signs of age or are poorly designed or built. The top left image there, the first Tay Bridge, one of the most notorious examples of engineering hubris. And the destruction when they fail is catastrophic. The bottom image is a single fracture, but that was found on the Forth Road Bridge, and it closed it for almost a month a few years ago. The consequences of that took politicians by surprise, because the bridge, by then about 50 years old, was assumed to be ever present. Planning decisions and strategic provision of public services like hospital critical care, policing, schooling, personal choices on where commuters wanted to live, all those decisions over a 50-year period had relied on the bridge always being available. Now, the original business case for the bridge was calculated on time saving by shortening a journey, but quite quickly the bridge had become far more than that. It became a critical artery built into the dynamic system of life-saving infrastructure. But no one fully understood just how important that had become until it wasn't there, because the system hadn't been properly modelled. Next slide, Marion. And the same applies to electricity. Once it was a luxury, now it's a basic life essential. When we have brownouts, it's painful, it's disruptive. For a short time, we appreciate it more, but we're always intolerant when it doesn't work. And the next slide. And worst of all, when infrastructure fails catastrophically, it can kill people. And sadly, we don't even need to have the awareness of history like the Tay Bridge to tell us that. Polcevera Viaduct in Genoa, Grenfell Tower, the Champlain Towers collapse in Miami. If we're not building safely or maintaining safely, sure, we're impacting on people's daily lives, but in entirely the wrong way. So, in the next slide, does the National Infrastructure Strategy recognise the importance of infrastructure and making the right decisions? Yes and no. Some issues are influenced by government diktat, understandably, post-COVID recovery, connecting the union, new routes to private investment. But much of the strategy also acknowledges the existential threat of climate change and the need to decarbonise the economy and resiliently adapt. And it accepts the need for further improvement in programme leadership, efficiency, productivity, and governance. I did count 10 uses of the word research within the strategy. I'd have preferred more, but at least it's there. UKCRIC researchers have been involved already in delivering aspects of the strategy. And I'm one of two technical advisors to the Union Connectivity Review referred to on the slide there, currently underway under the chairmanship of Sir Peter Hendy. Next slide. But while most of the aims are encouragingly supportive of the critical value of infrastructure and absolutely valid if taken at face value, there are also some nuances that seem to miss an important point. This statement here seems to me to separate infrastructure from the people that conceived, designed, and built it. But to categorize infrastructure as if somehow it could happen without people skills, the right governance structures and business environments is really quite wide of the mark. Infrastructure isn't going to evolve on its own. It requires to be planned and assessed. Decisions must be based on what to build and what not to build. The impact on people must be assessed by people and for people. People are part of the system. Skills and business environment are part of the system. So a systems perspective is required to fully appreciate how to make these components of infrastructure successful. Next slide. And here again, infrastructure will not level up Britain on its own. Well, infrastructure won't do anything on its own. It doesn't exist on its own. Skills, research, and innovation are as much an integral part of infrastructure as are the materials it's made of, the hardware. They're as much a part of infrastructure as broadband, digital connectivity, satellite communications, the software, if you like. Skills, research, and innovation and brain power are the wetware without which infrastructure cannot function, never mind deliver a strategy which requires transformational change. The strategy isn't saying, thank goodness, that we need more of what we've always done. It is saying that change is required. Indeed, a revolution in infrastructure is required. And you don't get revolutions by relying on extrapolating trends. So I hope we can accept that infrastructure per se cannot revolutionize itself, and that skills, research, and innovation are, in fact, the essential drivers of the infrastructure system and must therefore be the primary agents of any infrastructure revolution. So where can we look to for those skills and those talents? The infrastructure industry has skills, but arguably they're old skills for the most part. It can innovate, but rather slowly in a heavily regulated environment. The infrastructure and the construction industry no longer has any significant independent capability in research and development. There used to be labs associated with the bigger players like Wimpey and Taylor Woodrow. Government laboratories like BRE and TRL were much more substantial players. These are all thinner on outputs and impacts than they were 40 years ago. So where could we find the underpinning capability to deliver skills, research and innovation for an infrastructure revolution that can help level up the UK, adapt for climate change resilience, decarbonise the economy and improve productivity? Fortunately, next slide, we don't have to look far. We have the key elements for all of that in the existing UKCRIC network, a national network of infrastructure research facilities created through a coordinated programme of investments through EPSRC, the universities themselves and city and region deals over the last 5 years. It all gives the UK a state-of-the-art ability to provide cutting-edge research and infrastructure to benefit any national ambition to deliver, for example, an infrastructure revolution. There are 15 universities currently collaborating to provide a research powerhouse in infrastructure in cities. Every region represented except so far Wales and Northern Ireland. We plan to address that. And DAFNI is there as one of the key pillars, as Jim mentioned. Next slide, Marion. And the UKCRIC vision could almost have been written to support the National Infrastructure Strategy if only it hadn't predated it. Our very latest wordsmithing accepted. The reference to transdisciplinarity and systems-based research is actually a step beyond what we read in the NIS for reasons that I think I've already explained. Next slide. And the last 5 years in UKCRIC have been about the building blocks for that. Literally, actually, all these buildings are a bit blocky. And this is just a sample of them. Over £250 million invested by government and universities in new capability, now ready to revolutionise infrastructure in new capability and for infrastructure research. And that's what was promised by that investment, and that's what it still hopes to be delivered, subject to next phase funding. Next slide. Every vision for the future needs a mission for the shorter term. UKCRIC's no exception, underpinning research for renewal, sustainment and improvement of infrastructure in cities in the UK and elsewhere. And elsewhere might be the US, for example, with President Biden's announcement of $2 trillion investment in modern sustainable infrastructure and clean energy future. that should be seen as an opportunity for world-class research anywhere. And helping to prioritise, provide evidence, analysis, innovation for a safer, more resilient, more sustainable future. Next slide, Mary. Now, UKCRIC's got 4 scientific missions underpinning that. Broadly, the first 2 are about climate adaptation for a resilient future and decarbonising for a sustainable future. But the nature of research is to deliver through projects and programmes, and the goal for UKCRIC is to nurture those projects along, aligned to those big picture scientific missions. Next slide. And as an example, I can share new ideas here for a site in Rosyth in Scotland that built the 2 largest ships ever constructed in this country, which plans to develop a large footprint for a new innovation campus to bring together technologies of large-scale shipbuilding, manufacturing, infrastructure and digital engineering. Next slide. And the seed of this idea was formed when the UKRI investment in Fastblade for rapid fatigue testing of industrial scale composites was established. And the next slide. And the full vision of this collaboration with industry and academia is ambitious: to have data, digital manufacturing and robotics underpinning cross-sectoral advances in composites, large-scale manufacturing, large-scale modularization for infrastructure solutions. And these are the conditions for creating revolutions and competitive advantages. Infrastructure research benefiting from cross-sectoral collaboration with our other industries in a dynamic system of interactions. And if you recall, the National Infrastructure Strategy has accelerating and improving delivery as a core objective. Well, UK's governance and business model missions fit that perfectly, as does its 4th mission that recognises infrastructure is ultimately for people. Next slide, Marion. And here they are, ultimately for people to improve their daily lives, not just for the short term, not just for now, but for the indefinite future. And next slide, Marion. And an example of the people-focused research from our urban observatories in UKCRIC, work commissioned by government last year to gather data on the impact of the first COVID lockdown on traffic volumes in 3 city regions, and how then successive lockdowns impacted those real-life problems affecting real people through infrastructure. Next slide. And this slide summarises what we'd like to see as our component parts of a future UKCRIC to take full advantage of the investment already made by government through UKRI, growing the membership, operating as a national institute would operate, but geographically dispersed. We actually were levelling up before levelling up was a thing. And 3 strands: laboratory facilities, urban observatories and DAFNI. And next slide. And here's my take on where we are and a bit of a gap analysis. The commitment to collaborate and the distributed facilities are now in place. We've got green for that. And that's a massively important strategic starting point. It would take another 5 years to create the equivalent of a UKCRIC culture and collaborative mindset. There's a lot more to be done, of course, but we don't need to start from a blank page. We don't yet have the funded programmes of research that would be needed for an infrastructure revolution, but we're doing our best to work with the research councils and with industry to carve out what we can. The urban observatories are actually concerned about continuity right now. DAFNI, much less so. That's why we're here, celebrating that success. And we are, of course, delighted with that and UKRI's support for DAFNI. But the bottom line, literally there, is all about impacts. And I've shown that so far, ambers, only because the first phase has really been all about building facilities. But along the way, some impactful research has already been delivered. But with proper full research resource funding for the future, it could and should be much more. And the last slide, Marion. And if that works, in 5 years, we will have, through UKCRIC Open Inclusive Culture, delivered significant research impacts on climate adaptation and resilience, decarbonising infrastructure, productivity with benefits to people, closer ties with industry and government, a wider stakeholder base, and an even stronger UKCRIC identity. And those are the seeds that we need for an infrastructure revolution that the government wants to see. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Gordon, both for setting out the scene and the challenges around national infrastructure, and then explaining how UKCRIC is designed and is working to deliver on addressing those challenges. That's fantastic.